It is first introduced, the notion of self-determination was introduced in John Locke's influential essay concerning human understanding in the 17th century. And he talks about the idea that human behavior is volitional and not predetermined, and that humans have the freedom to act based upon will, and that all actions are in some way, shape, or form caused. So from the very beginning, we need to understand issues of self-determination in this frame of self-determinism. And that's important for those of us that work in the disability sphere for reasons I'll talk about in a moment. In the 1940s, as personality psychology emerged as a discipline, a subdiscipline unique from general psychology, its founders, like Andras Angiol, picked up this idea of self-determination as one of the core areas of inquiry in understanding personality. Angiol suggested that the field, the discipline of personality psychology could best be understood through investigations of autonomous determinism, self-caused action, versus heteronymous determinism, other-caused action and behavior. So again, Angiol drew from the understanding of the philosophical discussions, and then applied psychology's empirical lens to try to begin to understand human behavior through the lens of self versus other-caused action. His organismic approach emphasized that human beings are autonomous entities, that they are self-regulating, self-directed, and to a lesser or greater extent self-determined. In the 1970s and 1980s, motivational psychologist Edward Deci used the self-determination construct to begin to explain why people behave in ways that are intrinsically versus extrinsically motivated. And again, you can see the influence of John Locke's notion of self-determination in Ed Deci's early definitions. He talks about self-determination as the operation of will, the capacity to choose behaviors based on inner desires and perceptions. Self-determination is the process, said Deci, of utilizing one's will. Now, as Deci and his collaborator Richard Ryan further expanded their motivational theory pertaining to self-determination, they emphasized volition as a critical feature of motivation and of the fulfillment of basic psychological needs that were associated with self-determination, one of which would eventually emerge in their theory as the psychological need for autonomy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then looking at where Deci and Ryan pulled from, they also built on Richard Deschamps' notion of personal causation in conceptualizing their motivation theory and thinking about intrinsic motivation. And Deschamps referred to the striving of people to be, quote, causal agents in their lives, to make or cause things to happen in their lives. And one final slide to situate how we've understood the construct is the notion of autonomy as independence versus autonomy as volition. Our work has focused on the latter, the the importance in particularly adolescent development for adolescents to learn to make or cause things to happen in their own lives, rather than someone or something else making or causing things to happen in their lives. The importance, using Deschamps' term, of enabling young people to develop the skills, knowledge, beliefs, abilities that enable them to be causal agents in their lives. So in our work, we've tried to pull much of this together into a theoretical framework that enables us to build interventions, to build assessments that enable us to enable young people to become more self-determined. So over that time, and basically how we understand the self-determination construct, first of all, we've always thought about self-determination as a critical process within adolescent development. In every culture, in every context in the world, there are rituals, there are beliefs, and there are activities associated with the movement from being a child to being an adult in that society. And one of the critical elements of that is becoming a causal agent in your life, in becoming self-determined, in making things happen in your own life. So we've always understood this within adolescent development. Young children can acquire critical skills and experience that lead to later self-determination, but it is in adolescence that young people become causal agents in their own lives. Similarly, our understanding of the construct from people like Angial and DC and Ryan is situated in organismic theories of human agentic behavior, in which humans are actors in their own lives, rather than being acted upon, obviously. We see self-determination as meaning and being associated with people making or causing things to happen in their lives. And that's an important point for many of my colleagues who work in the disability sector, because when self-determination is understood as independence, when autonomy is understood as independence, it leads people to believe that people with disability cannot become self-determined, because there are obviously often many things that people with disabilities cannot do independently. They may be able to do with supports, but they're not going to be able to do so independently. And so if we don't understand self-determination as making or causing things to happen in your life, then too many people presume that people with disabilities can't become self-determined and thus don't make any effort. We have situated our work more in the broader realm of personality psychology. Personality psychologists are sort of allowed to pick and choose theory from other disciplines that enable them to build ways of explaining human behavior. And we've borrowed liberally from a lot of different perspectives. And there was already work in motivation psychology, so we weren't trying to develop theory around motivation, although in a moment I'm going to talk about how some of the work we've done has changed so that we can include more of a motivational focus on that. As noted, we understand self-determination as reflecting the autonomy with volition perspective rather than autonomy as independent. And finally, our theoretical work has been intended to drive the development of interventions that enable young people with and without disability to become causal agents in their lives and to become more self-determined. That in turn has enabled us to promote a strengths-based approach to understanding disability and positive approaches to supporting and enabling people with disabilities to live full, rich lives. So I've talked about how self-determination has been understood within across disciplines and across time. Let me talk a minute how disability has been understood within a disability context. How self-determination has been understood within a disability context. Within the disability sphere, and particularly the disability rights and advocacy movement that has emerged in the last decades of the previous century and the first decades of this century, the notion of self-determination as a personal characteristic has been imbued with an empowerment and a rights orientation, typically associated with the sense of the term as a national or political construct. When people with disabilities talk about issues of self-determination, they often talk about their desire to be able to make decisions in their own lives, to become self-governing, to have greater voice in their own lives. But they also talk about their rights as human beings to these. And of course, we recognize these rights in our many policy initiatives. Currently, the most visible one in disability is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability that's been ratified by countries all over the world. And the general principles of the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities begins first and foremost with a statement of the rights of people with disabilities to basically to be self-determined, to freedom, to authority to live their lives as they choose, as they prefer. So people with disabilities are very clear in their voice about self-determination as empowerment, as enhancing the possibilities for them to live as equal citizens in society. People with disabilities understand that unless we begin to focus on these issues of self-determination, they will not be given full citizenship in our societies. When people with disabilities talk about self-determination, they emphasize the connection between self-determined lives and dignity and respect and value and opportunity. Bob Williams, who is a disability rights pioneer in the U.S., wrote, he said, "We, meaning people with disabilities, don't have to be told what self-determination means. We know it is just another word for a life filled with rising expectations, dignity, respect, and opportunities." In fact, if you go back to the first use of the term self-determination in the disability literature, you go back to the writings of Swedish philosopher Bent Nurje, who wrote in 1972 about the rights of people with disability to self-determination. He was writing about the proceedings of a national conference of young adults with intellectual disability that had been held in Sweden in May of 1970. And in the opening paragraph, Nurje stated this. He says, "One major facet of the normalization principle is to create conditions through which a disabled person experiences the normal respect to which any human being is entitled. Thus, the choices, wishes, desires, and aspirations of a disabled person have to be taken into consideration as much as possible in actions affecting him. To assert oneself with one's family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and other people, or vis-a-vis an agency, is difficult for many persons, It is especially difficult for someone who has a disability or is otherwise perceived as devalued. But in the end, even the impaired person has to manage as a distinct individual, and thus has his identity defined to himself and to others through the circumstances and the conditions of his existence. Thus, the road to self-determination is both difficult and all-important for a person who is impaired. Nurier clearly articulated the importance of this personal self-determination for all people, not excluding people with disabilities. Echoing the themes that are employed by people with disabilities throughout the chapter, Nurier equates self-determination with the respect and dignity to which all people are entitled. More so, Nurier recognized that people define themselves and others define them by the circumstances and the conditions of their existence. Salman Rushdie, the noted British novelist, once remarked that, quote, "Our lives teach us who we are," end quote. When we segregate people, when we treat them as somehow different from the rest of us, we are setting in place a cycle that eventually results in far too many people with disabilities believing that they are the problem. The circumstances of their lives far too often have taught them that they are the problem and not society. So it's not surprising that issues of self-determination are linked by people with disabilities as fundamental to attaining respect and dignity, and to perceiving oneself as worthy and is valued, and thus is a reason that people with disabilities around the globe are demanding opportunities to become self-determined and to live self-determined lives. In 2015, we published a paper that presented a reconceptualization of the theoretical work we've used to drive our intervention and assessment development. We were interested in incorporating advances in positive psychology and strengths-based approaches to disability into our understanding, and as I mentioned previously, we wanted to better align the work we were doing with research in motivation and self-determination theory. So to that end, we proposed something we call causal agency theory, which is intended to explain how people become self-determined. We're interested in understanding how people become self-determination, what developmental functions, what experiences, what opportunities lead young people and other people to become self-determined. Within causal agency theory, we define self-determination as, quote, a dispositional characteristic manifested as acting as the causal agent in one's life. Self-determined people, i.e. causal agents, act in service to freely chosen goals. Self-determined actions function to enable a person to be the causal agent in his or her life, end quote. A dispositional characteristic, as many of you know, is simply an enduring tendency. People who are self-determined tend to act as causal agents in their life, although we obviously presume variation and variability across context and across circumstances. But generally, people who are self-determined act as causal agents. And this notion of causal agency, again, borrowing directly from the research in personal causation and in motivation, implies that it is the person who makes or causes things to happen in his or her own life. But it's more than just making or causing things to happen in one's life. The notion of self-determination and causal agency implies that the person acts with some intent, with an eye toward causing or affecting a change toward a specific end. So self-determined action is goal-focused, it's goal-oriented. I don't have time to go into it, but for those of you who work in the field of disability, and I've worked mainly with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, some portion of people with autism, people with intellectual disability, engage in problem behavior. It may be aggression, it may be other kinds of things. We've known for many years that problem behavior has a communicative intent, but what we've argued is that for many people, what they're communicating, it's their attempt, if you will, to gain some control over their lives. They're saying, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do it with you, I don't want to do it right now. So, you know, when we talk about self-determined behavior, we're not talking only about, you know, higher cognitive functions around, you know, difficult decisions. It's about making or causing something to happen in your life. Somebody who works with somebody with quite severe disabilities may act differently based upon whether the person smiles or not. People can become causal agents in their lives by other people paying attention to them and listening, if you will, what they have to say. Now, I'm not going to spend any time really with the theoretical work that we've done, other than to note that our perspective looks at self-determined action as composed of three essential characteristics: volitional action, agentic action, and action control beliefs. And these essential characteristics refer to specific actions performed, or the beliefs that drive actions that serve to enable the person to make or cause things to happen in their own life. Volitional action is simply the initiation and activation of causal capabilities like goal setting, decision making, problem solving skills that enable you to initiate action toward goals. Agentic actions function to enable a person to progress toward freely chosen goals and to respond to opportunities and challenges in their environments, and to direct action. And then finally, action control beliefs function to enable a person to act with self-awareness and self-knowledge in an empowered, goal-directed manner. Let me talk just very briefly about the work in motivation that has emerged and is talked about as self-determination theory. I suspect there are people in this room who are actually greater expertise on self-determination theory than I do, but I'm working at it. Self-determination theory, or SDT, is really a fully formed meta-theory that details the origins and outcomes of human agentic action. What SDT attempts to explain is why people act in ways that are intrinsically motivated versus extrinsically. And as I mentioned previously, at the center of SDT is the fulfillment of basic psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. The need for autonomy is satisfied when an individual experiences choice and volition in their action and perceives themselves to be the origin of their actions. Autonomous actions are those that are self-endorsed and congruent with one's values and interests. The need for competence reflects humans' desires to effectively master their environment and experience a sense of competence in that environment. And the need for relatedness is associated with social belonging. It's a satisfaction derived from a sense of connectedness with others, the need to care for and be cared for by others. And within SDT, humans engage in actions along a range of types of motivation and locus of causality, from extrinsically motivated and regulated to autonomously and intrinsically motivated and self-regulated. And it is action that is intrinsically motivated, that is volitional and internally regulated, that results in SDT's views, self-determined action. Now, in part, I provide this as a way to introduce our thoughts about the development of self-determination in adolescence. As mentioned before, and as per SDT, organisms, humans, are intrinsically motivated to strive to fulfill basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Efforts by a person to fulfill these needs and to act in an autonomously motivated and self-regulated manner result in a causal action sequence that is described by causal agency theory, with causal action beliefs enabling the person to take on volitional and agentic action to act as causal agents and to fulfill basic psychological needs, and that repeated experiences in this cycle leads ultimately to enhance self-determination. So with adolescence and development, it's these repeated opportunities as environments, as contexts threaten their basic psychological needs. They are compelled to take action to engage in causal actions that enable them to fulfill basic psychological needs, and the repetition of that enables people to become more self-determined. So let me try to wrap up relatively quickly here. We have worked, we have a number of things that we can draw then into practice. SDT itself has validated research in SDT the importance of teachers creating autonomy supportive classrooms. And they describe autonomy supportive teaching practices as including things like communicating frequently, expectations to children, acknowledging their feelings about the task that they're engaged in, offering choices and removing controlling events in the learning environments, allowing students to participate actively and self-regulate, providing positive and informational feedback, and providing structured guidance. In our work, we have focused on both an intervention and, as I mentioned, the development of assessments. Our self-determined learning model of instruction is basically, we answered the question, how do we teach teachers to teach students to teach themselves? We have a pedagogy of teaching teachers to teach students. And most teachers don't have a good understanding of how to teach students to teach themselves. So we developed a model of teaching. I won't go into it in great depth at all. There's plenty of resources online around this. Basically, these are from the teacher's guide that we've developed. And if you go to self-determination.org, you can download this, so you don't have to strain your eyes to see what that says. But basically, the structure provides teachers with a process that is driven by a set of student questions. These questions students answer, and they become self-regulated problem solving that solves a problem. The problem in the first phase is, what is my goal? The problem in the second phase is, what is my plan? And the problem in the third phase is, have I learned what I needed to know? And the power of this is that when students go through the process, they set a goal, they answer questions, there are teacher objectives that support them to do that. If they get, and they evaluate through self-monitoring and other processes, their progress toward their goal, if they're not making adequate progress, they go up and they change their plan because maybe they needed a better plan, right? And they try again. And if they change their plan often enough and they're still not making progress, the likelihood is they've set a goal that is not attainable. So they go up and they change their goal. But it's all student driven. It's not a teacher saying, oh, you can't do that. Oh, that's not a good goal. It is students going through processes, learning to be causal agents in their own life. We have very strong evidence, multiple randomized trial studies showing that when young people are taught to be causal agents in their lives, taught using the self-determined learning model of instruction, they have significantly more positive educational and adult outcomes, including more positive employment and independent living outcomes. We also know that teachers raise their expectations for children when they begin using the model to teach. So as I said, there's a teacher's guide that's online at self-determination.org. At the same site, we have constructed and normed an assessment of self-determination that teachers can use, but we also use it for research. It's around our causal agency theory, so there's three factors: volitional action, agentic action, and causal action control beliefs. And just one last illustration of where a positive focus can take us. We've been working some with an instrument that's available online, the VIA character strengths, the VIA inventory of strengths. It's a measure of character strengths. There are a number of these out there. But we were given an opportunity to develop a supplement to the VIA character strengths for youth that could be used for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so it's a guide that enables teachers. We've been working with teachers to begin to assess and to help teachers begin to think about, their students' kindness and their optimism and their fairness and their forgiveness, their capacity, their creativity, their bravery, all these things that we don't really talk about when we view disability in historic lenses. So, we, I think, have begun down a road toward strengths-based approaches, toward positive approaches to disability. I believe very strongly that we've gone as far as we can go to achieve the outcomes that most of us in a society want in supporting people with disabilities, if we continue to focus on sort of historic understandings of disability, and we don't move toward these strengths-based and positive-based approaches. We have some tools. There's tools out there. We have some knowledge, but there is a need for much more. And with that, I say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you.
So I want to thank from heart Professor Wehmeyer for his presentation, and of course we have the possibility to have some questions from the audience.
Good. Probably can't answer them anyway.
If no. Okay.
Okay, my name is Kamil Janowicz. I'm from Poland. I have a question not connected with disabilities, but rather, do you know, Professor, that self-determination, how is connected, for example, with imagination of future life, preparing life goals, plans, things like that? Because in my opinion, it's important as a motivation to do it.
Thank you. I can actually answer that question. We've actually been working with colleagues in Italy and a couple of other countries around who are in career and vocational counseling on life design approaches to career designing, career construction that looks at these issues of future lives and enables people to begin to think about designing their own careers, because the traditional job markets are changing, right? So, we're not going to enter into a career and stay in that career throughout our life course. Careers, jobs are going to be different. You're going to have to be, in many ways, self-determined and self-directed. And so I think that issues of self-determination are at the heart of that. And part of that process, and about which I'm not as well versed, is this notion of thinking about future selves and envisioning oneself in future roles, if you will. So I think it's very related, and in fact, I think it's at the center of what's going. And it gives me an opportunity to also say that our focus has been disability, but the work we're trying to do is really with all adolescents. It's not just adolescents with disabilities that need to learn how to be causal agents in their lives. So one of the reasons that we developed this new assessment is that we normed it with kids with and without disabilities, ages 13 to 22. And we've just been funded to do a very large randomized trial study where we implement the self-determined learning model of instruction with all high school freshmen, first-year freshmen in high schools in the U.S., both kids with and without disability. So I think it's at the center of these kinds of ideas. Uh-oh.
Thank you.
Well, if you see it as a developmental dimension, I would like to know if, I'm not in this field at all, so I'm really curious to know, if you see it as a developmental dimension, how does it change with age? And how does it relate with very fashionable concepts in developmental psychology nowadays, such as executive control? One. And two, if you see it as a dimension of individual differences, how does it relate to traditional dimensions of personality, such as, for example, the Big Five?
Right. I knew somebody was going to ask that question. So, actually, our measure that we normed with kids with and without disabilities only went live in August. And so we haven't had the opportunity to begin to look at longitudinal data, to look at sort of life trajectory around this. I think what we'll see is that most young people, by their early adulthood, are pretty self-determined. I don't think this is a construct that really fits in a sort of a traditional bell curve model. I think most adults are self-determined enough across the course of their life. And so I think that we'll see that there's sort of this type of and now many of us in the US, and I'm sure it's true here, in the phase of my life, I too celebrated my 60th anniversary this year. We're caring for aging and elderly parents. And what are the big issues that result in problems is their loss of independence, their loss of control, their loss of self-determination. So I think we're going to see that as adults age and begin to lose certain functions, it looks very, very similar, I think, to the kind of profiles we would see with people with disabilities. So that was your first question, and then the second question was the Big Five stuff, and I'll just beg off and say, I don't know, because it hasn't been looked at yet. I know that the first thing we're trying to do is to look at the construct validity between our measure and some of the measures that are in motivation theory that have been developed, so that we can make sure that they are consistent with those. And then I think we'd be interested in looking at some of the more widely used models. So I'll beg off on that.
Ms. Juanita?
Thank you very much for the very interesting speech. Actually, I have two questions. One is, we have been discussing here with Professor Pesavenghi, so the first question is a common question by both of us. So the first question has to do, does the type of disability play any role in how the program is implemented? So that's the first question. And the second one, because myself, I'm not in the field of disability either, but I'm developmental and educational psychologist, so I would very much be interested to know, since you have been working with teachers and organizing interventions with teachers, I mean, what was your experience working with the teachers? Because one problem that one challenge actually we usually face with teachers is their resistance to change. So how easy it is to convince them and also to make them apply all these theories in their everyday practice. So thank you very much.
So let me answer the second question before I forget it. And the answer to that is that it's difficult. I started working in this area in 1990. We developed the self-determined learning model of instruction in 1995. We're really only now getting to where we can begin to approach districts about implementing this more broadly. There are lots of reasons. Part of it has been the pressures on schools to test students, you know, for various reasons. Part of it is a generational issue in terms of people just, you know, I mean, in America, teachers, for good reasons, believe that whatever the change that's been introduced, if they just wait a year, it will go away and the next change will come. And that's what happens, you know, but my hope is that as young people enter the field, as, you know, folks who've been studying here and other places around the world, young people understand this as really important. And so that's where I'm beginning to see some change as we begin to look at that. You know, I mean, frankly, we had to work very hard to get really solid data on academic and other educational outcomes to show that this is something that has value. And I think this study I mentioned before, where we're working with kids with and without disabilities, can help us take that step. But it takes time, and you know, the issue of type and sort of intensity of disability. So it goes back to this issue of self-determination as making or causing things to happen in your life. I personally taught students with the most severe disabilities, many of whom could not speak verbally, had motor difficulties, maybe they didn't walk, they might have, you know, they often had concomitant impairments like epilepsy and you know, those kinds of things. But they do act on their environment in ways that get other people to respond and to do things, right? And so it's all about our process, and we emphasize this to teachers. It's not about students doing these things independently. It's about the student being in the center of the process, and that teachers who are using this model, they're keeping students at the center of the process. If the student can't set his or her own goal, the teacher's working with what they know about the student to set goals that are consistent with what they believe. They're doing the best they can, and I think that if they're doing that, they will be doing everything they can to keep the student in the center. What we've experienced is that students achieve more than what we expect them to, so that more students can do these things. And obviously some students with learning disabilities, dyslexia, other kinds of things, they can learn and do these things independently, and sort of it becomes autonomic for them, basically. They just do these things. But for kids with more extensive support needs, it's just about maybe changing a little bit that enables them to be a little bit more self-determined. So.
question, perhaps?
Thank you for that. That was quite enlightening to learn about self-determination from that perspective. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I work in rehabilitation.
Okay.
So my question is, how much of this is really crystallized knowledge? When self-determination comes about with the scale, I don't know your scale, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
But is there some quality aspect to it? I mean, like, we look at quality of life, we look at quality. I think quality is the most important ultimate goal. And so when you talk about crystallized or learned knowledge, is that what we're looking at, and not necessarily self-determination? That threshold of change is just that I know it so well. It's non-propositional knowledge, and that's why. I mean, I think it goes back to the executive question.
You know, and I think we've, you know, I think for us, although we didn't really work in motivation much of our career, what really struck me about the importance of self-determination are these notions of people acting based upon intrinsic motivation, and this notion of autonomy as volition, and so that's really a lot of what our work has been. Now, there's obviously lots of overlap, and of course you get into, you know, many of you probably work in self-regulation or, you know, autonomy. There are 100 different ways of thinking about these things. There's obviously similarities in a lot of these structures. You know, theory is useful to the degree which theory is important to the degree. One of the reasons is its utility, and for us it's useful to continue to think about it this way, and because it enables us to drive the intervention in certain ways. But I think there's, you know, I'm really interested. Self-determination is already one of the central constructs in positive psychology, but it's basically the SDT stuff. I mean, they haven't been that worried about intervention and behavior change in the same way we have. So I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes from here. So, did I talk around the question well enough?
Is there any other question? So, you have second chance, yes.
We are talking about this self-determination in context of learning, teaching, preparation to entrance for work market, finding occupation. But how you see this construct, this characteristic related to preparation for family life, because it's a very important aspect of our life. And as I know it, many people thought, also psychologists, that there's slightly little possibility of being prepared to being parenthood, things like that. So how self-determination could work here, in your opinion?
Yeah, so what I think I've come to understand about issues of self-determination is that, you know, we tend to pose these in more learning kinds of language. You know, we talk about goal setting and attainment. We talk about decision making and problem solving because that's what we teach children and youth to enable them to become more self-determined. But really, self-determination is about it's about often responding to threats and opportunities in your environment, and being able to, instead of these kinds of threats and these particularly threats to your own autonomy and your own self-determination, making you do things that aren't what you want to do, to go in directions that you don't want to go. They're the skills, the ability, the knowledge to be able to respond to that in ways that enable you to to really sustain your own quality of life, your own person. And of course, you know, we've linked over time issues of self-determination very closely to issues of quality of life, because it's really about you choosing and acting volitionally. So, getting back to the question, I think that nothing is a bigger change in your life than parenthood. I think that all of us have to learn and grow and change, and I think that what we would find if we would begin to measure these things and look at these things is that young people who are more self-determined, adults who are more self-determined, are better able to navigate these changes and these opportunities, and to move away from life where it's just focused on you to life that's focused on you know, that unit. So we often talk with families of children with disability, and we try to talk to them about the fact that, you know, family is an important support for people with disabilities, and it doesn't mean that they have to give up their whole life in the name of self-determination for their son or daughter. If you focus only on that child with a disability, every other aspect of family quality of life collapses, and that's not good for the young person either. So there's, you know, I don't think there's such, we don't talk about self-determination, family self-determination, because that's a different unit, but family quality of life is very much tied into all the family members being self-determined, having some volition, having some action. So that's where I would put that.
Thank you. So, if there are any other questions, I believe that we can close and go to the big ceremony in the War Museum. Another question, okay, please.
It was a very nice presentation up until now. In case of mental retardation, regarding people with disabilities, how can the self-determination be compared to children that are of typical development? Because I believe that there is a difference between mental retarded people and people with typical development. Can they, on their own, be educated to be self-determined, or will this education have an outcome in order to accomplish self-determination? Is this possible with people with mental disabilities? Thank you.
It's a good question. As I said, I think that everybody can become more self-determined. And that's really what we work with teachers, to enable people to become more self-determined. I'm not yet sure what it means to be fully self-determined. I think most adults are self-determined enough. And maybe as we get more data, maybe as we're able to measure the self-determination of typically developing adults, we'll have a better sense of that. But so the objective and the goal is really to enhance, and I think that the train just left. Hang on a second here. You mentioned, well, I've forgotten what I was going to say. But the goal is to enable people to become more self-determined and enable them. And we found that if we raise expectations, that young people can achieve much more than what others thought that they could achieve. Did that answer the question? Yeah.
So, in your hometown, there is a school that its program is organized based on the self-determination. Am I correct?
there is a school, there are schools that implement efforts? Oh, I'm sorry.
There are schools in America where their whole schedule and analytical program is based on self-determination. Am I correct?
Correct.
Is that applied?
Yes.
In the schools? Do you believe that we should copy that here as well, in our schools, and apply this in our schools? Do you believe so?
I believe that, and I've seen and had the opportunity to speak all over the world, and I have yet to see a society in which enabling young people with disabilities to become more self-determined isn't beneficial. So I believe, now, the important thing is that every country, context has different ways of making decisions, of solving problems, and it has to be operationalized in ways that are appropriate to the context and the country. But I fully believe that these same kinds of ideas would translate well to a Greek context, just as the country that probably has the second most work done around the disability context is South Korea, which is a very different context culturally and otherwise than the US. So absolutely, yes.
Okay, so let's go for a drink.
Yes, yes.
Because it's needed. Thank you very much, Professor Wehmeyer. Όσοι δεν ξέρουν, οι εθελοντές θα οδηγήσουν στο Πολεμικό Μουσείο. Είναι από την πίσω είσοδο του Πανεπιστημίου. It is behind,